Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. The Biggest Still. Hello there. Can you recall the Grays Harbor of Prohibition days when rum runners lurked over the Grays Harbor bar waiting for a chance to slip in with their cargoes of smuggled bottled-in bond? When the hills behind the harbor sequestered an assortment of homemade distilleries, and it was necessary to know a man who had a friend who knew a fellow who could give you a telephone number if the doctor prescribed a nip of the old mellow for your hay fever? Yes, it was quite an era. Not a glamorous era by any stretch of the imagination, but one that produced its share of tales, made lawbreakers out of a big percentage of the population, and ended with a nation who threw the dry law out the window and restored a human right that had existed since the days of Adam. Anyhow, it was the story of making fast-moving time, and back in 1930, just as the nation was getting used to the idea that the stock market's collapse meant a new way of life, there was a climactic event that the harbor long remembered, and some will still recall. It was the discovery, it was generally agreed to be the biggest still ever found in the hills of the harbor, although it wasn't found in the hills at all, and at the end of what might have been termed a major Grays Harbor industry at the hands of the revenuers. So when George has taken our customary few seconds for our sponsors, we'll be back to the story of the biggest still that made history on Grays Harbor a score of years back. If you can recall the Grays Harbor of the Prohibition era, you'll remember the high percentage of Grays Harbor residents that got themselves snarled up with the law over violations of the Prohibition Act. A lot of folks who are still among us recall the law closing in to take a peep at the bubbling stuff in a crock in the back room, or the packaged goods on the shelves in the basement. But the operator who got himself ensnared with the law most frequently was one who decided to capitalize on the Prohibition law and go into the distillery business. Here and there, through the backlands of the harbor, were those little copper boilers that bubbled and steamed and produced from their retorts a variety of vile-smelling, bad-tasting beverages that produced various effects on those who applied it internally. And the copper stills were few and far at best, for more than one distillery was made up of gasoline drums, and the problems of purity of the beverage produced from those tanks, together with the recipe used, were sometimes responsible for abnormal reactions to those who disposed of their Mountain Dew. There were many ruses devised to throw the government agents off the trail of their quarry. Stills were set up in hollow stumps, in attics, in isolated spots, in heavily wooded sections, in clam-digging shacks along the beach. But somehow the relentless revenuers found them out, and almost every week saw it round up of violators of the Volstead Act. Most of the distilleries taken were capable of making from 10 to 100 gallons of whiskey or alcohol per day, but occasionally a big one with a capacity for several hundred gallons was turned up, and the assortment of copper and galvanized iron boilers that came in to Aberdeen and Hoquiam's police station, operating base for the government agents, was a wonder to behold. Now along in March of 1930, the revenuers and the police of the harbor began to catch up with petty law violators who carried a stock of low-grade alcohol. It was all the same. It smelt a little of swamp water and was not a high proof, but it produced startling effects on residents of the community who ingested it. And while some of the peddlers of the beverage would have talked if they could, none of them knew much about where it came from, only that it came from over near Cosmopolis. Through the month of March, the stuff continued in circulation throughout the harbor. It appeared in quart jars, gallon jugs, and fashionable square-faced medicine bottles that would hold a fifth. It came in pint flasks and was found in tin cans in some purveyors' places. For weeks, the officers worked on the case and finally found that the alcohol was being distributed all over the Northwest through an underworld outlet. It was all unmistakably the same. And finally, working on a clue that Cosmopolis was the key to the solution, the government agents began to watch the movements of the small boat that came and went along the river above Cosmopolis. Once they had spotted the boat, it was not hard to follow it, and the officers trailed the wake of that little craft up the Chehalis to Preacher's Slough, about 3 miles above Cosmopolis. Then up the slough about half a mile to a swampy area where a small dock jutted out into the slough. The officer laid in wait up the slough from the dock and saw the small boat leave. Then they went ashore to investigate. The officers were 3 law enforcement agents of the government, well known for their thoroughness in their roughhouse days. They were Agent John Montgomery, Greg Grolton, and Harold Bird. They knew their business, and they went about it professionally. They surveyed the plant for making alcohol, for that's what they had found. And one lap around the premise assured them that they had made the biggest haul in Northwest history. The plant was set on pilings well back in the swamp. A giant distillery or condenser stood on one cluster of piles. The officer estimated its capacity at more than 1,000 gallons per day. The great mash vat were also piled, supported, and were filled with the fermenting stuff from which the alcohol was distilled. In addition, there was 590 gallons of alcohol and about 125 proof, 5,000 gallons of mash made from corn and wheat, and several $100s worth of sugar, corn, and other ingredients essential to the operation of the plant. This was stored in several small buildings scattered throughout the swamp. The officers estimated the plant was as representing an investment of no less than $25,000. Here was their alcohol plant, but now they must get the operators. They had permitted them to escape while they surveyed the still. Now they must trap them at work. That night the officers came back. They moored their boat upstream and watched the little dock for signs of life, but no one showed up to operate the plant. The next night the 3 minions of the law repeated their watch, but again there was no moonshiners to apprehend. But on the 3rd night, it was late on the night of April 4th, 1930, as the 3 lay hiding, they saw the little boat slide up the dock and the 2 men climb out and go ashore. The officers had noted that the place flooded at high tide, and that was only accessible up the slough, so they sent 1 man downstream in a boat to block the path of escape. Then the other 2, with Montgomery in lead, approached the big still. Stealthily, the revenuers closed in on the men, and while the 2 manufacturers of the spiritus fermenti loaded their boat with their cargo of alcohol to bring down the river to the markets of Grays Harbor, the officers sprang their trap. I won't tell you who they caught. One of the men still lives on Grays Harbor and is a respectable citizen, and the other I have lost track of. But let's say that they nabbed the 2 Grays Harbor residents who had built themselves quite an industry in illegal alcohol, along with their weekend cargo about to be shipped to the harbor's bistros. 70 gallons of the stuff was taken, and with the men under apprehension, the officers began to systematically wreck the plant, dumping the mash and the remaining alcohol and demolishing the equipment. They determined that the water from which the beverage was manufactured came from the swamp in which the plant was built. This gave the alcohol a slightly swamp root aroma that characterized it as low quality. Well, when their work was done, the two men, together with the 60 gallons of evidence, were brought to Aberdeen's police station for holding, while arrangements were made to arraign them before the United States Commissioner Charles W. Smith in Hoquiam. The case of the swamp water alcohol was solved, and the largest still ever discovered in the Northwest went suddenly out of business. And now it's time for George and a word from our sponsor. That was the year of 1930 when Grays Harbor heard with interest the story of the big still that went out of business. In fact, the biggest still of them all. That month, the new Roxy Theater opened on Wishkah Street and was prominently sold to Warner Brothers for $250,000. Dole McElroy and his orchestra were playing at the Union Hall for the Harbor Dancing Feat, and George Airless appeared on the Old Grand Theater in the Green Goddess. But the biggest excitement of that month was the haul that the three Prohibition agents made on Preacher's Slough above Cosmopolis, where they terminated the industrial activity of the largest illicit distillery ever taken in the Pacific Northwest. And officers to this day recall it as the daddy of them all, and the manufacturing where Grays Harbor attained its swamp water alcohol from the Prohibition days. And because it marked a top in the harbor's illicit alcohol business and provided a measure for the rest, and because it was typical of the era and the way of life which is now gone by, we provided a prominent place tonight in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.